Anin, Buju, Washte, Tlanete, Tangasugit, Wachie, Stan Wilson, Tisaniga, Son, Nainue, Anisin, Opaskwayak Oche. Most people who speak the language will understand the statement to mean, "Greetings, I'm Stan Wilson, a Cree speaker from Opaskwayak Cree Nation. Greetings to all our leadership and citizens of Treaty 5 territories. Greetings as well to all our relations. We give thanks to the Great Spirit, the Great Mystery, for our lives today and for the hope we have for a bright and prosperous future for generations yet to come. I want to acknowledge our ancient ancestors who have lived in our traditional territories for thousands of years, who developed our languages and knowledges based on their astute observations of the natural world. Their observations became the way of talking, being, and doing to fit into nature's ways. That way is referred to as our traditional indigenous culture. I will elaborate on that later. Thank you to all the leadership provided by Chief Easter and the Treaty 5 administration for the development of this organization that includes all the First Nations of Treaty 5 territories. It is important because it is only when we are united in our efforts will we succeed in retaining the territory our ancestors occupied before the arrival of the Europeans. Thank you also for hosting this summit on your traditional territory. I've been asked to share with you what I have learned in my lifetime about our heritage, languages, and cultures. Thank you for that honor and privilege. I don't know everything about the topic of language and culture, but I will share with you what I know as being true. The analogy Aspagemoin of the cultural iceberg is true for all languages and cultures. The top of the cultural iceberg is the visible parts of culture, the 5 Ds as they have been referred to: diet, what we eat; dwelling, where we live; dress, dialect, and dance. The larger hidden part of the iceberg that holds up the visible smaller part of the iceberg are the cultural values, assumptions, philosophy, ethics, norms, etc., that prescribe the desired behavior of its members. The analogy of the cultural iceberg is also true for words. Some words have levels of meanings that are not easily understood. It took me a lifetime to begin to understand this. I will use my own heritage language to show you how this works. Each of the Cree words have multiple connections to other words that are related. They form webs of interconnected words that then become part of the consciousness of the wholeness, inclusiveness that all things that are in the Cree language. A person with only one language would not necessarily disavow the hidden meanings in the words of their own language because they grew up with all the assumptions and values carried in the words of the language naturally as part of their daily lives. We must rely only on our own indigenous languages to guide our future. Pagota Spenimwak Kapigiskwewinina Tagiskinotaikuak, because they contain and carry the traditional indigenous knowledge systems. Our indigenous languages are the glue that holds our societies, our cultures together, because they account for everything already. our kinship and family systems, our education systems, our view of spirituality, our system of governance, how our economics maintain themselves, our territories, and even to the entire universe. That is the only base we can depend on to continue our development in regaining our sovereignty, the Penimisuin. My family and extended families spoke only Cree when I was growing up. I was introduced to English when I first went to school. It was my older cousins who interpreted for me to do the schoolwork the teacher wanted us to do. I continued to learn more English all the way up to the 8th grades at the day school. Then I left to attend high school in Prince Albert, living at the residential school there. I spent the summer months at home where the only language spoken was Cree. So I thought I knew and understood the language. As I found out later, it was the surface knowledge. I knew only the words. The meanings of the words carried, I came to understand later. It wasn't until I was married and working that I was introduced to the traditional spiritual practices and cultural customs and began to learn from such Cree elders as Ernest Tutusis, Smith Atimoyo, Robert Smallboy, Lazarus Rowan, Philip Deere, a Muskogee medicine man from Oklahoma, and later from Lionel Kanua, a Minnegojo Lakota from the Dakotas. It was during this time that I was asked to write a small book to be used in grade 5 classes as part of the social studies curriculum. It was to be about our community of Opaskwayak, as it was spelled back then. I asked old-timers what the word meant. These old men were in their 70s and 80s and had lived to see the bridge and the railway coming into our territory. They said the word meant wooded like narrows, Opaskwayak. The small book was used for a while. That explains the word Opaskwayak. I need to use my own heritage language, Neinuewin, to show how our own indigenous languages have been affected by colonization, affected by colonizers' languages, English or French, because they colonized our way of thinking, being, and doing. We can emerge from under that system, though, by using our own language. Kipigiskweweninawa. I am Cree. I am not Cree. I am Anishinaabe. The version of the origin of the word Cree, I believe, came from the Scottish word Cree. That was co-opted by the French and made into the French word C-R-I-S. Peggy and I made a trip over to Scotland for her to see her parents' ancestral land, who immigrated to our lands when they were young. Her grandparents came from Scotland and settled in Manitoba and Ontario. As we were driving from one town to another in Scotland, we saw a sign indicating Cree Town to the left of the road. We both looked at each other and I put on the brakes. We turned around and drove down this winding road to a village by the seaside. There was a huge sign at the entrance to the town explaining the origin of the name of the village. No, it wasn't because there were Crees living there. Cree is the Gaelic word for creek. It was called Creetown because the village got its fresh water from a creek that flowed down from the hills above. My belief is that it was the Scottish fur traders working for the Hudson's Bay Company that started referring to our ancestors as Cree due to them living along the waterways. It was part of their Scottish heritage and language. After we got back from the trip, I asked Dr. Bender, a local physician, what the word Cree meant because I knew he was from Scotland and probably knew Gaelic. He told me it meant a stream, a creek, or a brook. The French then probably heard the Scots referring to our indigenous peoples in the areas as Crees, may then have adopted the word and turned it into a French word. I don't mind the word credo itself because I am a stream of consciousness that originates in the celestial pool of ancient Cree knowledge. Those who thirst for that knowledge, like me, can quench it by drinking from that stream. That's why I'm using the word Cree in this text. The next event in my learning the deep meaning of Cree words was from the late Don Seti from Pemichikamat, who usually stopped to visit our family at Opaskwayak whenever he was going through. This was the first time I heard of anyone wondering what the word Nainaway meant. This was back in the early 60s. He suggested that the first part of the word neo means four. That part of the word reflects four natural cycles. Wapanok, Sawanok, Nagapeanok, Kiwetinok, Hagomina, Wapan, Apitagi, Sigal, Ati Tipiskal, Hevetipiskal, Kagit, Hagagi Tome Panigi, Hagagi Tome Panik Pimatisuin. This is part of the great circle of life. The word Neinuewin in that case would mean it is based on the laws of nature, natural law. The word Ininu also includes Neu, Kite, Kimamatuneni Chigan, Kiwio, Egokitata. There are Muskegee in Innuak, Agamaski in Innuak. That's why I say I am more than just a person. I am Anisininu. This is when I began to understand that this is a complex issue. Words by themselves can be known. A person can know all the words of the language, but they may not understand the underlying base of the language. To understand the language, the deep meaning of the words, hidden and carried in the word, needs to be uncovered. The hidden basic messages and meanings within the word is the system that connects the traditional indigenous ways of thinking into a whole, not just part of it. The spirit in the language is like our spirits, not easily visible. Yet we know when someone dies, we know that their soul or spirit has left their earthly physical body. We need to continue to nurture the spirit in our indigenous languages, otherwise they will die. Cree carries its own deeper meanings as hidden cultural messages. Words affect and impact hearts, minds, and spirits of people. Translating an indigenous language like Neinuewina Cree words into English, on the other hand, has the same effect. Only the word can be known but not understood because of the hidden meaning in the indigenous word that the indigenous word carries. The process of making the invisible meaning visible is an important one to comprehend because it remains hidden to the cultural insiders who are accustomed to looking outward only from their own view. Most people rarely look inward because they live and understand only their own worldview. They are too busy living their culture. The hidden cultural baggage needs to be unpacked to understand the words and the worldview the languages carry. But even if indigenous people speak English only, they could still understand their historic connection to their land and the rest of the relationships. This is because they are intrinsically attached to the Cree meanings of the words in English. They can get this understanding from knowing the basic words that provide the indigenous worldview framework. It is necessary for now, as a temporary strategy, to do the English translations. It is more important, though, to increase the number of fluent indigenous speakers as quickly as possible. Neinuewin is a relational language different from English that can be understood one word at a time. An example of the relational nature of the Cree language are in the words Wagotuin, Pastawin, and Uchinewin. They form a combined concept that requires knowing their connection to each other to understand the Cree worldview. Wagotuin is a single word, a verb as are the other words, making it very difficult to translate it into English as single words because English being a noun-based language and Cree being a verb-based language. Because Neinuewin is verb-based, the relationships the words represent are not static but fluid. Any action in one of the relationships affects all the others in the collection. It is like all are in an invisible spherical web with a person in the central part. The next sphere surrounding the individual is family. Next layer is the extended family. The next layer is the nation. Then all the other living beings on the land. Then the whole universe, the cosmos. Some time ago, I learned our Anishin origin story from Alan Keeper in Opaskwayak. He was showing me his traditional practice of taking young people and those who want to know about their no heritage into a traditional ceremony, starting with the Sweat Lodge teachings. That's when he told me the story I had never heard before. He told me of our Cree origins. Our ancient ancestors originated and came from Kakanatisitachak, the Great Spirit that resides there or is the North Star. It is sacred because all the other stars do a round dance around it every night. From our Earth's view, the North Star is the central point around which all other stars rotate or dance. Our ancestors then left the North Star traveling from one star to the next down the constellation known as the Big Dipper, and eventually ended up on the star at the end of the handle. When the end of the handle was closest to the Earth, they descended, Eginasichik, from there using a braid, landed Kiwetinok. Kiwetinok means homeland because Kiwe means go home. which makes the North our traditional homeland. Other indigenous nations too have stories that connect them to the stars. This is why Chakagopa are an important part in our ceremonies. Star blankets are a declaration of our connection to the Great Spirit. Turning now to the words in the introduction, who I am, I need to explain the other word, Tisinigasan. When I introduced myself, I said, Tansi, Wachie. The open hand offered in a handshake symbolizes a greeting with the heart and mind, with an open heart and mind. Stan Wilson, Tisinigasan. Tisi refers to my belly button. It serves or indicates my roots to the attachment at birth to my mother and to her mother's family line. It also means that we are directly connected to Kisemantu Tisi Chigewinda. It also refers to the ancestral ties to the land. The Cree ceremonial custom of taking the child's dried umbilical cord, which is seized, and burying it in a special place near their home achieves this. The meaning of the word Ochisis and burying in a space, the meaning of the word Uchi means that my umbilical cord is buried somewhere in Opaskwayak and is in traditional territory. In our Cree culture, women are the first teachers of the natural world, and the Cree language is rooted in the lands and waters we have occupied for centuries. When we follow our customs like burying the umbilical cord in a special place, we know that our ancestors who started the custom have been burying their umbilical cords, which is Yishuawa, for centuries. Following that custom ties us to our ancestors in that way through the land. When a person died, they were tied into a fetal position, just like they were in a position when they were during their mother's pregnancy. Then they were placed in a bag and buried in the sitting position with the head up. This was symbolic to being ready to be born again. The body was buried wherever family was at the time. There were no cemeteries or graveyards back then. Their remains became part of the soil that provided nourishment for plants. When a worm eats the grass or the leaves, they are being nourished by our ancestors in that way. The bird that eats the worm is also being nourished. The hawk or eagle that eats the bird is also being nourished by ancestors through what it eats. The moose that eats the leaves and twigs is also being nourished by our ancestors' remains. When we eat the moose, we ourselves are being nourished by our ancestors. That is the great sacred circle of life that continues as a cycle over and over. So when you walk on our lands, remember that you are walking on sacred ground. Walk gently. The word Kakinuniwago Maganak refers to all my relations. It is a necessary protocol that situates a person introducing themselves as being part of nature, not apart from it, the land and the universe, and being in a continuous relational process to all other forms of life and the cosmos. It is the base of a Nisinu culture expressed in the language and is the context with which all actions, behavior are bound. It is also the base of other Indigenous peoples' identities as well. This is what I found out from international meetings with other Indigenous peoples. Sanisinuak is important to renew because there are far too many young people who can only read and write in English because it is their only language. An example of the relational nature of the Cree language are in the words Wagotuin, Pastowin, and Ochiniwin. I already said that earlier. They form a combined concept that requires knowing your connection to each other. So I guess we can wipe that out. Each of these words are part of the whole concept of Wagotuin and need each other to comprehend the worldview. If only one word is known and even understood, it is only one part of the whole, making the concept incomplete. To get the whole picture, both the positive and negative need to be known and understand. It is like knowing there is night and day. They can be thought of as opposites, right and wrong, true and false. Both are part of the culture and need to be known and understood. The sacred teachings also need the non-sacred for them to be understood. Otherwise, there is no complete understanding if only half of the relationship is known. To be a good human being by follow the sacred teachings, the need to know the unsacred is important. The choice made between two behaviors needs to be clear to understand the impact of the choice made. Pastawan is from the word paskitena, open, and means you are opening the door into doing the unsacred, which has negative consequences, or it can also mean pastaha, kiga, Ochination, crossing pasitaha, kiga, Ochination, crossing the sacred line, which has negative consequences. What truth and reconciliation means is that each of us need to find ways of acknowledging and accepting our present positions and moving on to decide what aspects of our languages and cultures we think and believe are important enough to revitalize so that we can and will retain, maintain, and perpetuate our languages and cultures specifically to benefit the future generations. I suggest at the Treaty 5 level, we develop our own educational systems from our own worldview, our own ways of thinking and being and doing, all the way to developing our own standalone post-secondary education system to include an Indigenous graduate and research institute within our traditional territories. Hegusipitama, Kigawa. We go metinao metuniek omaga isi onas tamaswak ho onas suena. Kawana mama sis tutetan. Kinas metinao kitomina kawa megawinao. Kiseman tuga soene megawa mina oma ka tagamigisia. Egosi.